St. Michael's Church stood on the edge of Lakeview, nestled in the shade of old oaks. Every Sunday afternoon, its doors opened wide to admit the humble townspeople whose lives revolved around service and the pastor's word. Here in the heart of Tennessee, faith wasn't just a religion, it was a routine, an unshakable pillar on which the community was held. Henry Marshall stood in the pulpit and delivered the sermon. His voice sounded firm and confident, penetrating the souls of the congregation. "Love your neighbor as yourself," he said, never taking his eyes off the 3 neatly bound pages in front of him. The people in the hall nodded and looked at each other approvingly. In 15 years of ministry, Henry had become more than a pastor to them. He was a friend, a mentor, a man whose word carried weight in any argument. But even at this moment, when Henry should have been completely focused on his flock, his thoughts wandered far away from here. Somewhere in the back row sat Ruth Matthews, a hunched figure in a black dress, her dark hair falling over her shoulders. She always arrived at the beginning of the service and stayed until the end, lowering her eyes as everyone else left the church. Henry knew she was here for him. That knowledge burned him from the inside out. After the service ended, the congregation stretched for the exit, exchanging brief greetings and discussing the upcoming fair in the town square. Henry stood at the door, blessing people and accepting thanks for the sermon. He was smiling, but his eyes sought Ruth. She lingered at the end of the aisle, as if she were about to leave, but something held her back. "Good morning, Pastor." She finally came up, her voice low, as if she were afraid others might hear her. "Good morning, Ruth," Henry replied, trying to speak without too much warmth. "How are you today?" She nodded, lowering her gaze. Her hands fidgeted nervously with the edge of her purse. "I wanted to thank you for the sermon," she faltered. "It's always very comforting." Henry noticed the slight blush on her cheeks and couldn't resist smiling back. He knew he should break off this silent flirtation, but instead he heard himself suggest it. "Maybe you can find time to talk tomorrow? We have a sorority meeting, but I'm free until then." Ruth froze for a moment, then nodded, and her eyes flashed with something that might have been gratitude, or perhaps something more. "Yes, of course, Pastor, thank you." The next morning, Lakeview awoke to the measured singing of birds and the squeak of old wheels on gravel roads, the streets slowly filled with cars and bicycles. At the bakery, Old Man Hanks was arguing with the cashier about the price of fresh bread as usual. Ordinary life went on, and no one guessed what passions were simmering behind the closed doors of the houses, hidden under the masks of piety. Ruth awoke early, but did not get out of bed for a long time. She had not slept much during the night, her thoughts wavering between fear and excitement. It seemed to her that the whole world had turned against her, that the very idea of meeting Pastor Marshall was foolish and dangerous. But with every minute she spent in his company, her caution gave way to something else. Something strong and irresistible. She put on her best dress, tied her hair with a ribbon, and went to church. Henry was waiting for her in his study, a small, cramped room behind the altar, where the smell of old books and wax candles mingled with something inexplicably warm and cozy. "I'm glad you came," he said, as she came in and sat awkwardly on the edge of the chair. "I didn't know if I should," she admitted. "This is wrong, Pastor." "Sometimes people need comforting," he replied. "And it's not always a sin." He looked at her with a long, intense gaze, and Ruth felt her heart race. They talked for more than an hour, oblivious of time and everything around them. He told her about his struggles with doubts, his disappointments, and how difficult it was to be a pastor in such a small and close-knit community. She listened as if every word he spoke was water for her thirsty soul. That evening, Henry returned home where Mary, his wife with her cold gaze and withdrawn smile, was waiting for him. She served him dinner, but said nothing as he sat down at the table and began to eat in complete silence. She watched him like a predator watching its prey, but Henry didn't notice. His thoughts drifted back to Ruth, to her eyes, and the quiet awe he saw in them. "You're late," Mary said at last when he had finished. "You must have had a lot to do at church." "Yes, we had a few meetings," he answered briefly, avoiding her gaze. She nodded, but her eyes never took her eyes off him. She knew her husband better than he thought, and her intuition told her something was going wrong. Henry could feel the tension, but tried to ignore it. He hadn't yet realized that Mary had already begun her own investigation, gathering evidence like a detective. There were no words in this silent war that was unfolding between the couple, only the silent expectation of the first blow. Ruth Matthews sat on the bed in her small, modestly furnished bedroom. The first rays of morning sunlight streamed in through the translucent curtains of the window, painting the room with warm, golden hues. She looked in the mirror, but she seemed to see not her reflection, but ghosts from the past. Her thoughts went back to that terrible accident on the highway outside Memphis. Ruth's husband Peter had been driving. Light rain, wet asphalt, oncoming headlights, and it was over in an instant. She survived with minor bruises, but Peter was gone. All their plans, dreams, and talk of the future were scattered like ashes in the wind. It was after this that she left her home and moved to Lakeview, hoping the small town and church would help her heal. But neither morning services nor prayers could dull the emptiness that gnawed at her from the inside, until she met Pastor Marshall. The first meeting by the river was an accident. Henry was walking there to be alone and think, as he often did after a particularly hard day. When he saw the figure in black standing on the bank, looking out at the slowly flowing water, his heart sank. He recognized her immediately. "Pastor," Ruth said as he came closer, a little embarrassed by their sudden meeting. "I come here often. It's peaceful." "Yes," he answered, looking back at the river. "Sometimes silence is all you need." They stood side by side in silence, and that silence spoke more than words. From then on, they began to meet here more and more often. Henry told himself it was harmless, just talk, support, nothing sinful. But with each new meeting, his heart began to beat faster when he saw her figure on the shore. One day, during a particularly hot afternoon, they were sitting under a spreading oak tree. Ruth was nervously crumpling a scrap of cloth in her hands, avoiding the parson's gaze. "I must go away," she said suddenly. "It's not right." "What isn't right?" Henry looked at her, but she averted her eyes. "All of it. Us. I see you suffering." Her voice trembled. "And I don't want to be the cause of your suffering." He squeezed her hand, trying to reassure her, but immediately felt a prick of guilt. Her touch was so warm and real, and in that moment he realized he was already too deep in that forbidden feeling. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said quietly. "We're just talking." She looked up at him, her eyes full of tears. "What's going on in your heart, Pastor? Can you honestly say that these are just words?" He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled her to him, and in that silence, against the sound of the river, they found comfort in each other. Rumors in Lakeview began to spread quickly. Local women gathered in the cafe on the corner of Main Street, whispering about the pastor's lingering after church, about Ruth's increasing sightings near his house. No one dared to accuse him openly, but suspicions were growing. Mary Marshall had noticed it. She was always attentive to detail. Henry came home later than usual, looking confused, and answering her questions briefly and aloofly. At night he lay beside her, but his thoughts were somewhere far away. One evening, when Henry said he had to return to the church at once because of an alleged water leak, Mary felt a sharp prick of jealousy. She followed him silently, trying to keep a safe distance. The moonlight was dim, and the path to the river winded through a thicket of trees, but she walked steadily, as if some inner voice was leading her. Through the dark branches, Mary saw the figures of two men. Henry stood beside Ruth, his hand touching her shoulder. She could not hear their conversation, but she saw Ruth rest her head on his chest, and that was enough. Henry felt someone's eyes on him. He thought someone was watching them from the woods, but when he turned around, he saw only empty darkness and rippling shadows. He didn't realize that Mary had managed to hide in the thicket, silently waiting for him to leave. When he returned home, he found her in the kitchen, aloofly washing dishes. She didn't ask him a single question, but there was something unsettling in her gaze. Henry realized her silence was not forgiveness, but an expectation of something more. But he was too weary of his inner torment to try to release that tension. Mary continued to watch him. His every move was now suspicious. She noticed the way he looked around nervously when he thought she wasn't around. She didn't ask questions, but her distrust grew every day. For their next meeting at the river, Henry arrived earlier than usual. Clouds were gathering on the horizon, heralding rain. Ruth appeared with her head down as usual, but this time her eyes were determined. "I can't go on like this, Henry," she said before he could greet her. "You must choose. I don't want to be a mystery anymore." He stood silent, staring at her face, wet with the first drops of rain. As much as he wanted to hold her, he knew it was impossible. But making a choice meant destroying everything he'd built over the years. "I need time," he finally answered. "Please give me some time." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the intensifying downpour. Henry knew this was the end of their meetings, but he didn't yet realize that this choice might cost him more than he could have imagined. All this time, Mary watched from a distance, her eyes burning with cold fire. She couldn't take the humiliation any longer, and she already knew what she would do next. The storm was sudden and fierce. The clouds that had gathered over Lakeview seemed to burst into anger, pouring down torrents of rain on the ground. The rain pounded the narrow streets, eroding the dirt and turning the roads into muddy streams. The water rumbled into the gutters, washing away fallen leaves and debris. That evening, Ruth and Henry met by the river, hidden from view in a thick thicket of willows. "You promised, Henry." Her voice was filled with despair. She stood opposite him, soaking wet, her hair sticking to her face. "You promised we'd work it out." "I know." He ran his hand across his forehead, wiping away the raindrops. "But I can't do it the way you want me to. I'm bound by duty, by my family." "It's not that easy, Ruth." She clenched her fists, barely holding back tears. "It's not duty, it's fear," she said, her eyes shooting lightning bolts like sky discharges. "You're afraid of losing your comfort, your goddamn reputation." "But what about me, Henry? How much longer must I wait?" He looked away, unable to bear her gaze. Everything inside him was tearing at him. He loved Ruth, but he could not destroy the life he had built with years of hard work. "I'm only asking for a little time," he said at last, but his voice sounded uncertain. "We'll find a way out, I promise." "I'm tired of your promises," she whispered, turning away. "I can't wait any longer." She turned and ran away, leaving him standing in the rain. Henry stared after her, feeling his heart clench with pain. He wanted to rush after her, to stop her, but his feet felt like they were stuck to the ground. He knew this fight could be his last. The next morning, the town awoke to the clatter of voices. Something strange was happening in the church. The parishioners were whispering quietly, glancing around. Ruth Matthews had not shown up for Sunday service, which immediately aroused suspicion. She never missed a sermon, always sitting in her seat in the back row. Mary Marshall, standing at the door of the church, watched her husband closely. Henry looked tired and lost, and his sermon was short and stilted. Rumors of his relationship with Ruth had already been circulating around town, and now her sudden disappearance added fuel to the fire. "Have you seen Ruth?" the congregation asked each other quietly. "This is so unlike her." After the service, Henry closed himself in his study, feeling a weight come over him. He realized that people were beginning to suspect something, but his mind was now on something else. What could have happened to Ruth? He could not get her last look of despair and resentment out of his mind. By noon, there was not a single person in the town who had not heard that Ruth was missing. The local police began going door to door, questioning the residents, but no answers were forthcoming. It wasn't until late afternoon, when the rain had almost stopped, that a patrolman found her body on the riverbank. "Jesus," he muttered, putting his hand to his mouth. "It's Ruth Matthews." Her body lay among the wet leaves, her hair fanning the ground, her face pale and lifeless. There were dark bruises on her neck, the marks of a struggle barely visible, but too obvious for an experienced eye. Her bag, books, notebook, and scattered belongings were lying beside her. Her phone was out of her bag, the battery carefully removed. Detectives James Daniels and Rachel Wilson arrived at the scene an hour after the report. James's heavy boots squelched on the eroded ground as he surveyed the scene. Rachel was already bent over the body, scrutinizing the footprints. "Strangled," she stated briefly, rising from her knees. "Judging by the marks on her neck, it was a ligature, but I don't think it happened here. Why not? James looked around. Look at the marks. Rachel pointed to the long streaks on the ground. The body had obviously been dragged here from somewhere else. It looks like an attempted staging. James leaned closer and noticed that the ground under the body was drier than the surrounding area. Someone had taken the time to make it look like a robbery. Ruth's personal belongings were strewn about, but nothing of value had been taken. It all looked too neat for a normal attack. It was carefully planned, James muttered. Someone wanted us to think it was a random killing. Or it was done in a hurry, Rachel objected, studying Ruth's phone. The battery was removed so we couldn't trace the last calls. The killer clearly didn't want to leave any clues. The next morning, the whole town was on its feet. The local diner was discussing the incident, trying to guess who the culprit might be. Suspicions fell on everyone and no one. Pastor Marshall avoided unnecessary conversation by locking himself in his office. But Mary could see his nervous gestures, his uncertain steps. She knew her husband was hiding something. Detectives began interviewing Ruth's parishioners and loved ones, trying to figure out who might have wanted her dead. With each new witness, the picture became more confusing. Everyone knew about her frequent visits to the pastor, but no one wanted to talk about it out loud. Mary Marshall acted suspiciously calm, but all of her answers were precise and impeccable. James and Rachel decided to visit the Marshall home. Henry met them on the doorstep, looking completely distressed. "I have no idea who could have done this," he said, avoiding a direct look. "Ruth was a good woman. She never hurt anyone." But the detectives could see he was nervous. When they asked him about his connection to Ruth, he began to ramble, and his answers sounded strained. Rachel never gave up trying to catch his gaze, but he stubbornly stared at the floor. "Who else had she been talking to lately?" Rachel asked, writing down his answers. "I'm not sure. She was lonely. Her life was withdrawn," Henry answered, but there was uncertainty in his voice. In the evening, as the city slipped into darkness, Henry sat in his bedroom, staring out the window. He knew his world was falling apart. Ruth was gone, and now everything he had built over the years could crumble because of one single sin. At that moment, he didn't notice Mary quietly walk to the door and freeze in the shadows, watching him. Her lips formed into a thin line and her eyes flashed with a cold gleam. She knew more than he could imagine. The first rays of sunlight seeped through the morning mist on the riverbank, highlighting the haphazard footprints on the ground. Detective James Daniels bent over the body, studying the bruises on Ruth's neck and wrists over and over. He'd been here for hours now, since the body had been discovered, but the more he looked, the more questions he had. Rachel Wilson, his partner, was surveying her surroundings. Her attentive eye slid over small details: drag marks, crumpled bushes, scattered personal items. She fumbled for a string of clues that seemed subtle, but pointed to a deliberate staging. "Look here, James," Rachel beckoned to her partner. "See how the ground's been disturbed? The body's obviously been dragged here. And look at the tire tracks. Last night's downpour eroded everything, but they're fresh enough. You think she was killed somewhere else and then brought here?" James straightened up and looked at the tracks, trying to visualize the crime scene. It looked like it. The stuff is too neatly scattered. It looks like a cheap attempt to fake an attack, but why are her wrists so badly damaged? She was bound, but why? Rachel squinted, analyzing the situation. James nodded, but his face remained stony. He knew that things like this were rarely an accident. For now, however, things were too confusing. When they returned to the police station, a long series of interrogations began. The Lakeview parishioners invited to talk seemed confused and wary. People in the town were not accustomed to such investigations and were in no hurry to share information. The first person invited into the detective's office was Mrs. Clark, a middle-aged woman who took the third-row seat every Sunday. She twirled a handkerchief in her hands, avoiding a direct look. "We've seen Ruth with the pastor a lot," she admitted hesitantly when James asked her a direct question. "But you know how things are around here. No one wants to believe the worst." "Often," Rachel clarified, leaning over her notebook. "How many times? When you've seen them together?" "Well, I can't say exactly. Sometimes she stayed after the service, and the pastor was kind of supportive. She'd lost her husband. Everyone felt sorry for her. Mrs. Clark shrugged, as if trying to absolve herself of responsibility for her words. But the detectives couldn't get anything concrete out of her or anyone else they interviewed. People either really didn't know anything, or were afraid of incurring the wrath of the pastor and his wife. Lakeview society was a closed society, and everyone knew that words could backfire on themselves. James and Rachel went to Ruth's house, hoping to find some clues. Her small house was perfectly clean, as if Ruth had always tried to keep everything under control, even when her own life was falling apart. But on the desk was her bag, and inside it was a notebook. "What have we got here?" James flipped through the pages carefully. Most of the entries were related to her work as a teacher, but then, near the end, there were personal notes. Rachel crouched down next to him, peering over his shoulder. On one of the pages was written, "Meeting with G, he promised something important tonight. Hopefully, it will finally be cleared up." "Who's G?" Rachel mumbled, making a note in her notebook. "I think we both know the answer to that question," James said grimly. "Pastor Marshall. But we don't have proof yet. It's just circumstantial evidence." Rachel agreed, but her intuition told her that there was more to the inscription. She couldn't shake the feeling that Mary Marshall knew more than she was letting on. They headed toward the Marshall house. Mary greeted them with a strained smile, offered them coffee, and invited them into the living room. The house was perfect, and so was its owner. But there was an uneasiness in her eyes that was hard to hide. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mrs. Marshall," James began. "We'd like to ask you some questions about Ruth Matthews." Mary folded her hands in her lap and nodded, showing no emotion. "Of course. I heard what happened. It's awful that someone could do that to poor Ruth." Rachel noticed her fingers clenching convulsively at the edge of her dress. "Did you know your husband was intimate with her?" Rachel asked bluntly, not averting her gaze. Mary froze for a split second, then let out a short grin. Henry was always attentive to his parishioners, especially those who needed help. "But if you're implying something else, it's not true." "We're just trying to figure out what happened," James said softly, trying to lighten the mood. "And to find out who might have wanted to hurt Ruth." Mary answered flawlessly, but her overly calm demeanor didn't convince Rachel. She sensed the woman was hiding something. As the detectives returned to the crime scene, Rachel continued to study the tracks on the riverbank. The tire tracks she had mentioned earlier indicated that the body had been brought here in a car, but the rain had eroded any possible evidence. "It was clearly an SUV or a pickup truck," she said, looking at the blurred prints. "Every other car in this town has one of those. Without hard data, we can't prove anything." "What about the forensics on the wrist marks?" James asked. "We need to figure out what she was bound with. It was probably a belt or a rope, but we don't have either of those things on site. Otherwise, we'd know how to work with it by now," Rachel replied, leaning on the hood of the car. At the moment, all they had was guesswork and vague evidence. James realized that if they didn't find hard evidence, the case would drag on for months. Early morning greeted Lakeview with a cool fall fog that shrouded the streets and drew the city into a ghostly silence. The police station was already bustling with life. Officers were discussing new evidence. Forensic scientists were laying out photos and reports. James Daniels and Rachel Wilson were back at work, armed with new results from the trace analysis. "Looks like we found something interesting," Rachel said, nodding at the printouts on the table. The expert confirmed that the tire tracks found by the river are almost impossible to identify. They could be on half the cars in the city. But what was strange was that one of the tires was different from the others. James raised an eyebrow when he heard that. "Explain, Rachel." "You see," she pointed to the photograph of the tracks, 3 of the 4 wheels leave the same mark, and one has a different tread. The expert said it's a tire from a different manufacturer. The average person wouldn't have noticed it, but the forensics guy saw it right away. "So someone changed the tire," James thought. "Now we just need to find the right car." The detectives decided to visit Pastor Marshall again. The pastor's house greeted them with silence and tense anticipation. Henry opened the door with his usual tired expression, as if he had already resigned himself to the fact that the detectives would be visiting his home until they found answers. "What happened this time, detectives?" he asked, trying not to look them in the eye. "We need to ask a few more questions," James said coldly, walking inside. "We found some new evidence. Henry frowned, but gestured them into the living room. "Mr. Marshall, did your car have a tire changed recently?" she asked, peering into the garage through the ajar door. Henry, a little miffed, nodded. "Yes, about a couple weeks ago. One of the tires went flat, so I put a spare in. But that's common, isn't it?" Rachel noted his nervous demeanor. She pretended to be satisfied with the answer, but something inside her said it wasn't the whole truth. After the visit to the pastor, the detectives decided to conduct an in-depth analysis of the Marshall family's financial transaction records. Mary's bank statement seemed clean at first glance, but upon closer examination, Rachel discovered something suspicious. "James, look at this!" she called, spreading the statements out on the table. "I think we have a match. Here are some transfers to an unknown account, and they match the dates Henry met with Ruth and the dates of the incoming payments in Ruth's account." James squinted, running his eyes over the lines of statements. It looked like blackmail. But who was blackmailing who? Was Mary paying Ruth to end her relationship with her husband? Or was Ruth threatening to ruin their lives? Judging by the sums involved, it's not just compensation for silence. Maybe Ruth decided to demand more and Mary couldn't take it, Rachel suggested. As they pieced together the details, the detectives realized they needed to return to the church where Ruth and Henry often met. In the silence of the church, the sound of their footsteps now echoed beneath the vaults, where usually only prayers were heard. James and Rachel made their way to the small room behind the altar where church items and icon hangers were kept. Rachel stopped at the shelves piled with old chains and straps for hanging large icons. Her eye caught one of the hangings, a thick braided cord with a distinctive pattern she'd seen on Ruth's wrists. "James, look at this," she called to her partner. "That's what left the marks on her wrists. It looks like she was bound with one of those harnesses." James examined the cord and frowned. "It's definitely from this church," he said, and it looked like it had been used recently. They headed toward the Marshall house. Mary greeted them with her usual cold politeness, but her face turned pale when Rachel showed the pictures of the hanging marks. "We found the same in your church, Mrs. Marshall," said Rachel, without taking her eyes from her face. "And it was the same cord that had left the marks on Ruth's wrists." Mary stood as still as a statue, but her eyes began to dart from side to side. I don't know how it happened," she whispered, her voice shaking. James slowly stepped closer. "We know about your transfers to Ruth's account. We know you were trying to pay her to keep quiet, but something went wrong, didn't it?" He paused, looking at her. "She demanded more, and you decided to solve the problem drastically." Mary clenched her hands into fists, her face turning even paler. Tears began to stream down her cheeks. "I didn't mean to kill her," she whispered, lowering her head. "She threatened all of us, said she was going to reveal this horrible secret, the dirt she'd dragged my husband into. I just wanted her to go away, but she wouldn't stop. I was scared. And so you tied her up, strangled her, and used your husband's car to dispose of the body," James summarized. Mary nodded, exhausted, as if all her strength had been drained from her. She couldn't hide the truth anymore. "I was really trying to protect Henry," she added. "I thought I would save him and our family." After Mary's confession, the detectives went to break the news to Henry Marshall. He was sitting in his office, his face gray and gaunt. "Mary has told everything," James said quietly. "She confessed to the murder." Henry was silent for a long time, staring at his hands. "It's all my fault," he said at last. "If I hadn't let myself be tempted, none of this would have happened." Rachel shook her head. "It's not all your fault, Pastor. Everyone made their own choices. But sometimes the consequences of our actions are more devastating than we can imagine." Henry stood up, wrapping his arms around his head. He realized that his life in Lakeview was over. He could no longer stay in this town where every street, every stone now reminded him of his sin. The next day, the town fell back into routine. But behind the closed doors of the houses, people discussed what had happened. They could no longer look at St. Michael's Church the way they had before. The town had changed. Its faith had been shaken. James and Rachel watched Henry Marshall drive out of town in an old pickup truck. Rachel turned away as the car disappeared around the corner, but James was still watching. "It's all about faith, isn't it?" he said quietly. but sometimes faith is more dangerous than any sin. People will do anything to maintain the illusion that their world is perfect, Rachel replied. They started the car and headed back, knowing that they would have new cases ahead of them. But this case would stay with them for a long time, as a reminder that the darkest sins often hide behind the lightest of masks. The courtroom was filled to capacity. Lakeview townspeople who had once listened to Pastor Henry Marshall's Sunday sermons now came to witness the trial of his wife. The trial of Mary Marshall had attracted the attention not only of the locals, but also of journalists from neighboring towns. They were all eager to hear the details of this case that had rocked their small world. Mary sat at the defendant's table with her head down, her face pale and her eyes clouded. She no longer seemed like the cold and unapproachable woman who welcomed the detectives into her immaculate home. Now before the court stood a fractured, tired soul, entangled in her own fears and delusions. Mary's lawyer tried to argue that her act was an act of desperation, an attempt to protect her family and preserve what she thought was crumbling before her eyes. He emphasized her devotion to her husband and her godly life, but the prosecution was adamant. "Mrs. Marshall, do you plead guilty to the murder of Ruth Matthews?" The prosecutor, a short man with a harsh voice, stared at her. Mary raised her head slowly. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but there was such silence in the room that everyone could hear her. "Yes, I admit it," she said, her voice trembling. "But I didn't mean to kill her. I just wanted to protect my family, my husband." At those words, her voice broke, and the hall filled with muffled whispers. People looked around, trying to understand what she meant, but it was too late for explanations. The sentence was handed down: 15 years in prison for manslaughter and attempted staging. As she was being led out of the courtroom, she turned around and for a moment met the gaze of Henry, who was sitting in the back row. There was pain and regret in his eyes, but not judgment. He knew that each of them had played a part in this tragedy. Henry Marshall left Lakeview immediately after the trial. He could no longer stay in a city where every corner reminded him of a life lost, a fate shattered. Now his path lay elsewhere, away from those who knew his sins. It was several months before he found his new home, a tiny village in the mountains, where an old, almost abandoned church stood in the distance. The place was so secluded that even the rare locals didn't often stop by for services. Now his life was simple and measured. He mended the roof of the church by himself, cut the grass in the churchyard by himself. Green hills and dense forests stretched around him, and Henry found peace in the stillness of nature. No one here knew his past, no one knew his name. On Sundays, he still came to the pulpit, but in front of empty pews. He did not speak loudly, not to the congregation, which was almost non-existent, but to himself, trying to find forgiveness and comfort in those words. Sometimes local farmers passed by and stopped to listen, but more often the church was empty. In the evenings, he would sit on the steps for long periods of time, watching the sunset. He realized that he would never get his old life back, that the past would stay with him forever. But now, in this distant place, among the quiet mountains, he felt that he had found, if not redemption, at least the possibility of living on, however humble and lonely it might be. The past remained with him like a shadow, but he had learned to live with the burden. Sometimes at night, he dreamed of the faces of those he had betrayed, Ruth, Mary, his parishioners. But in the morning, he would get up again, go to the service, and deliver his humble sermons, hoping that someday his soul would find peace. And so the days, weeks, and months went by. The little church in the remote village became his only comfort, and its walls held secrets that no one else could ever know.